Hello, and welcome to the meeting. Please enter your passcode followed by the pound or hash key, and please hold while I confirm your passcode. Thank you for joining Global Meet. The host has placed the meeting into a listen-only mode. When you hear the tone, you will be the 310th person to join the meeting. This meeting is now being recorded.
It would be simulation. If I look at the needs that we have arising in the transportation domain, we know that good software simulation is going to be an important aspect of proving that the systems that we're building are reliable, that they're safe, and that they do what we want. And simulation has been used in robotics for decades. Our team has been working on it for over 20 years in various forms, and it's a common tool in the toolbox for anybody developing a complex physical system where you can't realistically test all the time on the hardware, nor can you necessarily encounter all of the corner cases that you need to convince yourself that the system will be able to handle every possible scenario. And we can look back at the 2016 RAND study, Driving to Safety by Nidhi Karla and her colleagues, where they argued statistically that there is no way that any fleet of cars can realistically test drive itself to safety, and that we need other tools to convince ourselves that the systems we're building are going to do what we want, that they're going to be reliable enough. And simulation is not the only tool, but I think it's an important one. And so where I see that need coming together with the open source community is that if we think about the goal here being to convince ourselves, to convince the broader industry, and to convince the public that these new mobility solutions are safe and can be trusted, then I think it's incumbent on us to make as many of the tools as possible that we use to test those systems open. And simulation is one where we can make a big contribution. I think that it should be a requirement for regulatory agencies that both the scenarios that are used to test and verify vehicles, as well as at the very least the simulation tools that the government and regulatory agencies themselves use, that those be open. There's no reason for them not to be. They should be shared with everyone, available for introspection, for improvement. That doesn't mean that there's not room for perhaps proprietary simulation tools in particular areas, but what's used as the gold standard for testing, for making sure that these systems are ready to get on the road as part of a broader battery of testing, I think can and should be open.
Well, that's very interesting, and you kind of hit it on the head. There's a lot of areas where we talk about simulation, how important it is, and simulation we use across industries. I mean, we look at simulation in different fashions, and especially in the transportation side, we use simulation to forecast the capacity of our roadways so we can, drive investment and drive design work. And now we're seeing this technology really evolve into the system, and we're trying to figure out what are the requirements in which we simulate their impact to the system. And I think that's where we lead this right to our next panelist, Raj Pinallari from Florida DOT. Thank you, Raj, for being here. He is the State Connected Vehicle and Arteria Management Engineer for the Florida Department of Transportation. He's helped Florida become a national leader in the state programs for connected vehicles and transportation systems management and operations. We call that TISMO. He brings to our panel the critical perspective of state and governments and transportation infrastructure and systems they manage with local partners. So Raj, thank you so much for being here. And this kind of blows right into you. How do you, as state DOTs, see open source software, and how can we help state DOTs prepare for the future with this emerging technology that's been around for a while? Raj, you're on mute. Do a quick mic check. There we go.
Sorry.
Yes, sir. Welcome. All right.
It's
the hurricane, right?
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Really, such a pleasure to be with really eminent people here today. Yes, great question. How do states have to go forward? At the end of the day, it really boils down to understanding what the industry can offer. I mean, many state agencies, pretty much, I see the Blaine Leonards and Amanda Ham of the world on this call, so that's great to see them. All state agencies are pushing the state safety and mobility goals in the respective agencies. And that means to get safety and mobility to happen, we need to understand what the industry is capable of doing, what the industry is willing to do at the end of the day. At the same time, the industry is looking forward to understanding what state agencies would like to accomplish. I always give this example of near-miss identification safety system. How do we go about understanding where the crashes are occurring? How can we proactively use technology to diagnose the issues, come up with countermeasures, implement them, and solve problems even before they become problems, so to say. So there needs to be a very good collaboration between public agencies. And when I say state agencies, I'm also talking about local agencies, and understand the industry needs. At the same time, industry would also need to consider the capabilities, the funding constraints, the resource constraints, the capabilities, the maturity level at which different agencies are in developing tangible platforms. Long story short, open source platforms are really beneficial only because when you get into the V2X data exchange, for instance, when you start bringing multiple partners to the table, you cannot have one single way of doing things. You have to be as open-minded as you can. You got to have good data user agreements in place to facilitate this transfer of information. Christine Shafiq from our Florida DOT is on the call. She runs the state Sun Guide program. The Sun Guide program is so crucial in the state of Florida. It connects with all the TMCs. There's a way to push the information, the center-to-center communication happening. So open source software is eventually going to be one of the key parameters at the end of the day, if you really want to start making this connected and automated vehicles a reality, especially when you start talking about higher penetration rates, etc. And Brian was talking about the need for simulation. So simulations also need to understand what kind of software needs exist today. Last point, as we put more projects out there, we get a lot of questions from our vendors and the industry partners. And one of the questions is typically associated with OSS. What level of detail do you want? What type of software infrastructure needs exist? So we talk software, but we also need to talk about the hardware needs. So good systems level architecture is going to be essential. Look at Karma, the cooperative driving automation system that is being developed by Federal Highway. Such a great initiative, because when FHWA puts a lot of time and effort building a very strong base, state agencies like Florida can learn from that. So instead of reinventing the wheel, there's some lessons to be learned from what you all have done already. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Raj. Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear your perspective. You know, as we move through our panelists so far, we've kind of talked about how open source has been around for a while and how federal government were really trying to pursue it from looking at the value of open source and what it can provide and the stimulation that it can enable us to start understanding these new things that we're trying to build, and looking at it from the government perspective. How do we deploy this technology? How is open source helping us understand what's required? Joe, I'm going to look at you now, and I'm going to introduce you as the field chief technology officer, one of the boots on the ground trying to figure out and deliver on open source technology. You are at AdLeak right now, and you're a leading provider of software and hardware solutions in the embedded computing industry. You've spent your whole career developing and advocating for open source at organizations, including the Linux Foundation and IBM. You bring an important private sector corporate perspective to our panel today, and we're so happy to have you. Joe, I guess my question for you, how do companies invest in OSS today, and how do we transfer this success of OSS from other industries to transportation, and how do we go about that? So, Joe, welcome.
Always a pleasure, Taylor. One of the things we're seeing, like with open robotics and ROS, that's what's taught at every university worldwide, and which maybe gave a little bit of reputation of, it's for academics. But you see now this huge corporate investment of, all of my peers on the ROS 2 Technical Steering Committee, big industrials, technology companies, and not all of them are roboticists, but what they are is, they're software engineers, they're architects, they have QA and process. You see this, radical renovation and improvement of open robotics for these kinds of applications. And then you've got people like AutoWare and all of the tier ones and OEMs and other technology providers involved in there, where AutoWare is autonomous driving for ROS. And then you've got Eclipse Foundation and people like Bosch and AD-Link and Siemens and so many others involved there, where we are working to develop how do you do like an automotive grade, real-time functionally safe middlewares that get built into open robotics, that is built into AutoWare autonomous driving, and you really complete this whole ecosystem. I was working a lot with an obscure telemetry protocol at IBM, and I thought it was something really special. And so I spent years making open standard, open source. And, when I say me, me and my friends, nothing amazing ever happens by an individual in isolation, right? So, there's a community of people that believe in this. And I thought it would be something special, something really good for cars. And I like cars. So a lot of executives told me, that's silly. You'll never get automakers to adopt this. So I took it as a personal challenge. And, within 24 months, had Daimler, PSA, Conti, Ford, Scania, a bunch of others using it. So that's MQTT, which is now how all the vehicles are connected to cloud. It's the on-ramp to all the clouds. And so, what we did around that in terms of, and even, NHTSA, I had asked, could open source have a role in automotive safety? And, I was ridiculed. So I came back a year later and said, yeah, this is Angela Merkel on stage with that. I did that thing that you ridiculed, and now it's built into Continental systems, right? So that thing that we did there from a connectivity perspective, that's what the whole community of us is working to do around the autonomous driving, the collaborative functions, so the B2B coordinated activity. And in a lot of ways, it's just like it's a robotic swarm. It's just a swarm of bigger robots traveling faster. And And one of the things, in the robotic space is funny because, automotive people, they think, autonomous driving, like that's automotive industry. But, at ADLink, because we manufacture from credit card size to crazy things that are dual Xeon with 40,000 NVIDIA CUDA cores in a box, right? I end up touching a lot of companies, a lot of people throughout the segment. And really, in my head, you talk about it, one end of the spectrum is iRobot Roomba vacuum cleaner, and other end of the spectrum is passenger carrying vehicle on the highway. That's all autonomous driving. And it's just, to me, they're the same. It's a matter of scale. So you scale the speeds, you scale the sensor suite, you scale the compute, and you scale the risk. But one of the things that's amazing is when iRobot does a fundamental contribution to the efficiency, the latency, the stability of ROS2, that ripples all the way through to AutoWare, okay, all the way through to the vehicles. And when the people working on the vehicles do something to make it real-time functionally safe, that ripples all the way back through. So, vacuum cleaner, passenger vehicle, and all the things in between, campus mobility, autonomous wheelchair, AGV, autonomous delivery, because COVID, huge upswing in that. So, yeah. It's an exciting space.
Yeah,
I'm glad to be working.
Very exciting. And as you can see, it touches this entire spectrum of the economy with all these different areas. But the question then is, how do we then start to trickle this into transportation? And you gave some really good examples of how you've done that. And I think we're going to be starting to see this culture change a little bit more as we start thinking of all these Internet of Things and all these new devices that are coming into the market and how we look at the transportation system as a whole. So, Joe, I really appreciate your feedback on that. It was very, very good. Carlos, we're going to pass it back to you for a couple questions.
Yes, great. Thank you, Taylor. We do have a couple more polling questions here for the audience. So we'll ask that you please take a couple of seconds to fill out these next two questions. And the first question asks, how often do you use open source software in your current job and or other pursuits? We'll give this a few seconds here. Glad to see that every day has a good amount of responses.
And a different question would be, how often you use it every day and don't even realize it?
Yeah, maybe you can't answer that question because you don't realize it.
We'll give this a few more seconds.
If you've used the cloud today, you have in fact exercised open source.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we'll move on here to our next polling question. And the next question asks, what open source license have you encountered the most?
This is a good question.
And as always, if you have one that falls under the other category, please feel free to use the public chat.
Yeah, there's definitely lots of licenses out there. I remember when we started looking at Karma and trying to identify what's the appropriate license. There's a ton of licenses out there. It really shows how open source really, there's a lot of different ways it can be used. So yeah, it's great to see these examples here. I hope those of you are continuing to write in the chat log. I see a lot of different examples in the chat log with different licenses, and it's there's just a lot of ways we can do open source. This is good.
Yeah, arguably the plethora of licenses has been a double-edged sword because sometimes it can be confusing to try to pick the right license for a given project. For people who are confused by that, there's an article that I'm sure we can dig up from Bruce Perrin from several years ago. At the time, I think the Open Source Initiative had officially blessed something like 72 open source licenses, and he argued that was 69 too many, and that in the end, you should use GPL v3 or Apache 2, where there was a narrow circumstance in which a third license, which doesn't come to mind right now, could be used. And basically, it's a nice analysis that kind of argues, it gives you the rationale for how to pick.
Great. I think we will wrap up this question, Taylor, and I will hand things back over to you.
All right. Well, Brian, I think that was excellent dialogue. I think that you make a very good point. Maybe there just needs to be one license, and it's open source is open source. So I guess the question I have for you now is, what innovations are the nexus of transportation and open source are most exciting you see growing?
Well, I think that perhaps the most exciting thing that mobility industry and transportation industry represents for open source is the ability for these tools that we as a community have been working on literally for decades to really directly touch people's lives. And as Joe just argued, this is already happening every day when we use the internet. But it's arguably the case that putting open source software into physical systems that we interact with, that will represent a step change in how the extent to which people are interacting with and relying on these systems that we've been building. So I think, it's a chance for the broad global open source community that's been building these tools. And when I say these tools, I mean everything from the Linux kernel, LLVM, glibc, everything up to robot specific tools and then autonomy systems on top of that. It's an opportunity for that entire stack of software to really be in the spotlight, and for people to hopefully, to the extent that that story is public, because it's not always public that a given product or service is based on open software, but to the extent that it's public, it's a way for the entire world to appreciate the fruits of the labors of this entire community.
Any other panelists want to add to that? I mean, that was a really good observation.
I can ask.
The question is,
I have I'm going to actually read a quote that I saw this a week ago in an article. I can't recall who it was written by. I think it didn't have an author, but it says, "In open collaboration, participation is egalitarian. Decision making is meritocratic, and people are self-organizing. People choose projects, processes, and tasks rather than getting them assigned to them." I think that's just like a really powerful statement when it comes to just software development in general and open source. It means that, you can have folks from all over the world working on a project. You can have folks with all different skill levels working on a project, and that it kind of like, it builds on itself, and it has this like movement. It's a movement, in other words. So I thought that was pretty powerful. And I'll try to continue to quote that from now on.
Taylor, if I can quickly. Oh,
Raj.
Yeah, Taylor, if I can quickly add, especially with the advent of connected and automated vehicle technologies, but even if we just go a few years before all of this has happened, Eddie Curtis was on the call. He knows full well the Federal Highway Administration UDOT has championed the automated traffic signal performance measures. Just one example of how you take the high definition data that come out of the traffic signal controllers based on the Darcy-Bullard-Purdue system, Purdue signal performance measures. Indiana DOT, Jim Studevine, they all championed it. But it came to UDOT, and UDOT took on the big step of creating a software process where all the data was being brought in. They were really doing it for their purpose, but UDOT became such a national champion along with Federal Highway and Eddie Curtis in promoting. Today, many of the private sector products with ATSPM, the automated traffic signal performance measures, I can trace it back to the ingenuity and the leadership shown by university DOT collaboration, and then Federal Highway got in. But then, I see a similar trend happening in the connected vehicle industry today. As you put more and more roadside units out there, the onboard units that are out there, is there a need to bring in the ITS infrastructure information, the video collection that happens from the field ITS devices? So there's a gradual convergence that is eventually going to happen. It's already beginning to happen. So this again, it goes back to industry and agency collaboration. And how do you bring about the data exchange platform to make real-time decisions in practically real time? That sounds a little silly when I say real time in real time, and practically zero latency time period with your cooperative driving automation system. All these things are eventually going to come together and fuse and create those data sets, which would benefit not only the implementing organizations like state agencies and traffic engineers, but also the car companies and the drivers at large. Queue warning, speed harmonization, there's a whole range of applications with integrated corridor management. So these things are likely to happen in the near future, not too distant future, because of the conversations that we're having today. Thank you, Taylor.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. I thought that was very insightful. I mean, you kind of walked through a little bit of how we've been thinking about the transportation system for many, many years, and all these ways that we're trying to do new ways to manage the system. And I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about, what Amin just talked about, about the collaboration and just, the ability to bring people together. And it's the open source culture that is what I'm hearing is that's what's going to enable us to think of things we didn't think we were building for, or, we stumble upon an idea as we are looking at it from a different lens. And I think that's the value of what it sounds like open source could bring to transportation, is the value of innovation that we weren't out to build. It comes about from how we see and how we bring people together in the culture of a collaboration. So I think that's great. I think that's exciting for transportation. So, I mean, if I go back to Amin and ask you a question, in that statement you said, it was very powerful. What would be the number one issue regarding the future of the work in OSS that might keep you up at night?
I think there are two things. One is policy adoption. So far we've had great policy adoption, I think, dating back to 2016. But another thing that I think is more relevant, and I think Joe kind of touched upon this, is the adoption and the reuse. Especially for us on code.gov, like I said, we have 7,000 projects, but those are just projects that are sitting out there. We're not 100% sure who's reusing what repository, how often they're being kept up. And so that drives me a little bit crazy, because I want to see the best for all these projects, and I want to make sure that they have the proper metadata behind them so that they're discoverable. But you can have an open source project but no community behind it, no adoption. So that scares me a bit, or a lot.
So what about everybody else? What keeps you all up at night for open source?
So for myself, one of the things that's really troubled me here in the automotive space for like a decade is that you have all these automakers, all these tier ones, basically working from, let's just call it identical functional requirements, okay, around like automotive safety, ADAS, all these kinds of things. And yet each of them are building their own closed source software in isolation. And my assertion is that the safety of the public, the safety of all of us as a community is too important to be closed source. And you already look at, like with Linux, for example, where everyone agreed that, working together to make a better, faster, safer, more reliable, more secure operating system is in all of our mutual interest. So how do we do that for open source? And, you know, the concession is the automakers, well, we'll agree on some specification and standards so these closed source pieces can be interoperable, but I don't think it's far enough. And so I'm really emboldened by what I see with so many people adopting, working with things like the Eclipse Foundation middlewares from the OpenADX Autonomous Driving Working Group, using that with Open Robotics, ROS2, which was architected for these kinds of use cases, underlying the auto-air autonomous driving. You know, that's where I think you start to get somewhere. And there's so many people working with that now. And one of the things I noticed was most of these organizations are doing something with these to some degree, and the ones who say they aren't are lying. So that's going on. The other thing that keeps me up is, you know, as we work and progress with open source, you know, how do we work as a community to make it real time, to make it functionally safe? But once we have it real time and functionally safe, there's a whole nother issue, which is how do you certify it or make it certifiable? Because the requirements around traceability and all these things to get ISO 26262 are kind of at odds with how you do iterative open source development. And that all these ISO standards were written based on an assumption, a presumption that this is a straight waterfall methodology, and that's not how open source works. So that's something we have to work through. So as a community, we're committed. We're going to make it real time. We're going to make it functionally safe. And, you know, if we knew anyone in government, maybe they could help us with how to navigate making these things certifiable.
Well, that's great. That's great. Brian, how would you answer that question, you know, when you think about ROS and where ROS is going, especially with ROS 2 just being released, which is very exciting. What keeps you up at night on the open source side?
Well, yeah. ROS 2 has actually been released now for several years. We're up to Proxy Fitzroy, and we started at A, so we've had several releases that have come out over the last few years. And as Joseph mentioned, we're one of the reasons that we made the painful decision to start from scratch with ROS 2 was specifically to target these safety and mission critical domains in a way that is better and more amenable to certification than ROS 1 is. So I'm very optimistic about the prospects of ROS 2 in those domains, including the automotive and transportation industry. What worries me? I think it's the same thing that's been worrying everyone in the open source community from the beginning, and that's whether campaigns of fear, uncertainty, and doubt will succeed. And you still see this today, even despite the incredibly widespread use of open source software across almost every domain that you can imagine. You still find people who are basically arguing that, oh, that's just some open source software, right? That's the thing that you use in the lab before you want to do it for real. Or my favorite canard is that's open source software, so that means it's insecure. And at best, those two things are uncorrelated. It's frankly more likely that the open source system is more secure because you have more people able to find flaws and improve it. So I think that is still sadly something that we have to argue against. And I think that some of the organizations that Joe mentioned and the government work that Amin is talking about are helping to professionalize the reputation of open source software. And that's an important aspect of the communication campaign to convince everybody that, yeah, this stuff it's free for you to take and use however you like, but that doesn't mean that it's somehow unprofessional or that it doesn't meet your needs or that there's not a company that's ready to come in and help service and support and do all the things that you expect when you buy software. I remember in the early days of ROS, we had a major automotive company come to us and tell us that they wanted to try ROS, but they weren't allowed to use open source software. They weren't allowed to download it from the internet. They literally asked us to sell them a laptop with ROS installed. And just on principle, we refused. It just didn't make any sense, right? We told them, no, go back and talk to your management and figure this out because that's insane.
Well, that's great. It's a great story. And that kind of then leads me to Raj. I mean, you know, what's one thing we can start doing today to better position our organizations for the future of transportation?
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. I was going to quickly connect back to the previous question. I'll say one thing and
Sure.
answer the question too. I think the big thing that most agencies are beginning to face is the issue of cybersecurity. I mean, it's reasonable to say that once you get into anything open, with the word open in it, with open source software, open anything, the whole open concerns come up, which are cybersecurity, physical security, electronic security, and then even security credential management system. Here in the state of Florida, we started deploying SCMS 2.5 or 3 months ago. I have to tell you that we put a lot of time and effort in making it up and running to the point where the vendors are comfortable too. So the industry also wants to know what are some of the predicaments or what are some of the risks associated with going with open platforms. I mean, as a former traffic engineer myself, I'd be thinking 10 times before I would let anybody open my controller cabinet. And with this, what they call number 2 key being available on eBay for $9, anybody can get into the controller cabinet today. So yeah, there are many things we worry about, the least of which is what happens when hacking happens. So to your question, Taylor, institutionalization and implementation really become the key. I mean, just let's look around. At the national level, we have many committees on connected automated vehicles being discussed today. It is the same group of folks who appear, which is great, which is good. But then do we have a second-tier leadership at these entities? When you go to state agencies, whether it's the ITS or the TSM window programs or connected vehicles or traffic signal programs, once again, it is the same group of professionals who are developing, implementing, and operating the system every single day. Do we have a second-tier leadership? There's a need to institutionalize this. You go to the regional and the local agency level, there's a lot of need to upgrade the capacities of the young professionals out there or even seasoned professionals. So there's a need to institutionalize the processes there. When it comes down to implementation and deployment, there is no question that a good system approach is important. The systems engineering, management plan development, concept of operations, etc. But some of these things probably take a long duration. And by the time you're ready to do something, technology would have moved on. And the Brians and Joes of the world have already developed version 3.0 when I'm still doing 1.0 development. So the point is, how can you be agile? How can you move quickly and the pace at which you need to move? So there needs to be a comprehensive workforce development training at many levels, at state agencies in the public sector, at the consulting sector. I know I have a lot of consulting friends on this webinar today. There's several of my friends, and I'm sure they would agree with me that there's an across the board training and an understanding and knowledge capacity building that needs to happen going forward. So these are at least some of the things we can look at from a non-technical point of view. Thank you. Thank you, Stefan.
Raj, in the space you deal with, it's inherently difficult to move quickly because you're dealing with high risk, right? You're moving humans. And so what I'm seeing is much of the innovation improvement is coming from lower risk domains where they can iterate quickly with very little risk to safety. And honestly, one of the best examples of I've seen is Singapore GovTech and Changi General Hospital and the work they're doing with Brian's open robotics team, where you have this 800-bed hospital and you're trying to help the nurses, assist the staff. So you've got an incredible degree of automation, all these small autonomous vehicles, right? Roaming the hospital, and they're coordinated that they don't run into people, they don't run into each other, they can collaborate on tasks. They can call an elevator, so they're doing V2X, they're interacting with the infrastructure around them, so they can call an elevator. And when the elevator arrives, if a robot is already in the elevator, it coordinates that it scoots over so the other robot can enter the elevator. And all of that work is open source and available to be built on and iterated on. And so, I think, look elsewhere for a lot of the innovations and new technologies, but then you have to figure out to iterate and contribute and harden them. And the contribution is the key thing. There's a lot of people that use open source. There's a smaller number who contribute, and contribution is not that hard. If you fork it, you copy it, and you fix it and adjust it and improve it for your scenario, you do something called a pull request that basically contributes that work back to the community. And that's how we'll get this where we need to go.
Absolutely. And you're right, Joe. I mean, when we look at the whole evolution, I'm going to use the word evolution, of the connected vehicle program the last 5 to 7 years, with Federal Highway bringing on the 3 US DOT JPO projects in Tampa, Hillsborough, Wyoming, and New York. Those 3 projects have really established the base for what can be done. And from there, many other states, even with and without the 3 JPO projects, states like Utah, Blaine Leonard is on the call, and several of us under the Connected Vehicle Pool Fund study, for instance, we discuss these topics pretty regularly. And you're absolutely right. State agencies should be willing to take the risk, take that step forward, get their feet wet, try things out, see what works and what does not. Fortunately, we all have a good research and development program, and many of our projects actually get into these elements, the evaluation of what happens when you go open source type of thing. So it is kudos to the many folks from the state agencies, and I'm kind of speaking to them in a way from the Connected Vehicle Pool Fund study and other groups. We're really proud to collaborate with Federal Highway and industry partners to advance very quickly, as fast as we can. But yeah, great things are happening as we speak.
Yeah, and I think that was a great dialogue. You know, that's what we're here to talk about. When we think of open source, the example, Joe, you talked about with healthcare, you know, healthcare is delivering goods. You know, maybe looking at the transportation system and saying, well, let's deliver goods first, or let's focus on some of those really good, successful parts of the system that we can start to improve. And through those iterations, we can get to that level of comfort for moving other types of participants in the roadway.
They're all vehicles, and if they're autonomous, they're all carrying a payload. Sometimes the payload happens to be human beings, right? So, you know, when we did all our work on the open source autonomous bus for elderly and disabled, you know, the way I explained it to my children is, you know, Accessible Ollie is a robot. It's a robot that talks to people and it carries people.
So how would you say we drive adoption of open source software? Joe.
So we're already on a pretty good trajectory with Open Robotics ROS is taught at every university worldwide. So that helps. That you know, to have these technologies be taught at every university worldwide is a pretty good place to start from.
That's great.
You've got Open Robotics providing the basis, you know, that you can then build your autonomous driving. I think that, you know, we will have to work through some of the FUD around what does safety certified or certifiable mean, and you know, I think with these ecosystems coming together of Eclipse Foundation producing IoT middlewares with contribution from people like Bosch and AD-Link and many others that are then built into the Open Robotics, that is then built into the autonomous driving AutoWare. I think it's gonna go fast. Some of the federal, some of the regulatory constraints around some of these things, you know, whatever we can do to foster these things. And I think, you know, some of these PSC locations, pilots, getting waivers. This is why, you know, people ask, when are we going to have autonomous vehicles? Well, they're already here. They're just not evenly distributed, right? So, you know, until Uber got kicked out of my state, you couldn't go to a stoplight downtown Scottsdale without seeing a few Waymos and a few autonomous Ubers all waiting at the same stoplight.
Very interesting. So, I mean, how would you answer that question if we talk about how do we drive adoption of open source software from the federal government and how that could help maybe?
Yeah, from our perspective, it's encouraging everybody to participate, no matter how small the task is. So we have on code.gov an open tasks section where project teams can post some issues they may be having. They can be at the beginner level, intermediate, or expert level. And folks can come in from all over the world and tackle those problems. And so once you start on those projects, I think you'll be able to learn about the actual project itself. You maybe come in there every now and then and provide comments or issues, or like Joe said, a pull request or something that maybe you have come up with. The other thing I think for IT shops is, and anybody for that matter, is to kind of get over the whole imposter syndrome idea. You know, all of us are software engineers, or not all of us, but some of us are, and some of us are learning. Some of us have years and years and years, but we still don't feel we're quite there. And so making it easy and not judging and kind of like working with people on that and providing the right documentation so that you can start a project or launch one, that to me makes it easier for adoption. And then I think to round it out, it's from a government hat, it's to be organized and communicate often. So talk about your successes, talk about your troubles, write about it, post about it. We do that all the time. We try to work with agencies to just highlight their successes or the things that they want to do, and just getting it out there will help. I think and we've seen it help. So it's empirical. Yeah.
If I may, I think the role for government to play here, as is often the case, is to carefully use its purchasing power. So in this domain, government is buying R&D services from many companies and universities and other organizations that are doing some of the fundamental work to produce the algorithms and the science. And they're also buying the systems that eventually get deployed. And in both cases, the government agencies, in my view, should do everything they can to encourage and even require the use and development of open systems. Since 1980, the Bayh-Dole Act has limited the federal government's ability to put constraints on how a contractor's IP is used. Basically, the government can only get government purpose, government use rights under most contracts. But what most people don't realize is that contractors are, by and large, if they choose, allowed to open source the results. I mean, what the Bayh-Dole Act says is they can keep the IP. One of the things they can choose to do with the IP that the government paid for is open it. And the government should encourage contractors to do that as much as possible. I often get asked from other contractors, even people in government, saying, wait, who'd you get permission from to open source that? And I said, no, the government paid for it. We own it. What we chose to do with it, instead of putting it in a closet or selling it, was to release it under an open source license. And the government could absolutely encourage that kind of behavior in all of their funding and procurement activities.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I really appreciate the context of this discussion. It's really, grounded us down. And I know Carlos has a quick question we got to put up here as we round out our time, but yeah, this has been a great discussion.
Yes, Taylor, I just wanted to echo that. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much to our panelists. We did have one last poll question for you, and it's now that you've heard this great discussion today, we want to know, have any of you used any of the following open source resources? And you can select all that apply. I'm sure there is some overlap, and many of you have used more than one of these. So please take a few seconds. We'll just take maybe 30 seconds on this one before we wrap up today's session.
All right, come on, Karma. Come on, Karma. It's like a race here. It looks so cool.
It only lets me vote once.
Well, thanks for putting a one for Karma. No, but this has been a good discussion. So I really appreciate it. As we round out these questions here, the poll question number 6 for those of you on the phone, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. This has been a very exciting opportunity, to have this discussion about open source and how do we bring it to transportation. I think this question is not answered because it's an agile process. We're learning today, and tomorrow we're going to do something a little bit better, differently, and every day we're going to keep applying these practices. And I think that's the main intent of what we learned today. So I really appreciate everyone. And Carlos, back to you.
Thanks, Taylor. And for those of you who are still on the web, we do have some resources available. And again, we will make this information available to the public. But there are some resources available in case you are interested in learning more about some of the discussion that was had today, some of the topics that were covered. And then finally, just a call to action. For those who would like to be more involved with the Karma program, there is contact information on the screen currently, as well as a hyperlink to join the Karma community. And the U.S. DOT Connected and Automated Vehicle CAV support services, there's information on the screen for that as well. And again, we will be sure to share this information with everyone who participated on today's webinar. We did record today's session. And again, a recording of the session will be made available for public viewing. Thank you very much again to USDOT FHWA for organizing today's session, and a special thank you to all of our panelists, to Taylor Lochran, to Joe Speed, to Raj Pomnuri, to Amin Mir, and to Brian Gerke. There's a great discussion today, and I know we all appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining us, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.